with artillery, with drone missiles, with Apache rockets. And by the end, the entire area was flattened. Now the violence in further south, in the border area of Huzah, just east of Khan Yunis, was severe without the invocation of the Hannibal Directive. This is where residents were trapped for 6 days under fire and were unable to get out. I visited Huzah and met members of the Najjar family. Hani Najjar told me that he managed to escape, and when he returned, he found 5 charred bodies in his bathroom. They had been handcuffed, riddled with bullets. Their throats were slit with the knives he used to slaughter his chickens. And the bathroom was still, the walls were still drenched in blood and flesh when I was there. And this was almost a month after it happened. Members of his family were used as human shields placed on the roof while soldiers sniped at their neighbors. Around the corner, I met the Rujela family who lost their daughter Adir. She was a 16-year-old epileptic who couldn't keep up during the escape in her wheelchair and was blown out of her wheelchair by a tank shell at the exit of Huzah. I interviewed 2 paramedics who told me about losing their colleague as they tried to evacuate the body of a man who'd been tied to a tree and executed. The paramedic who had coordinated with the Israeli military was ordered out of the ambulance, told to take 5 steps forward, and then shot in the chest in front of them. They later encountered a woman in her 80s who had spent 8 days in a chicken coop, hiding from the soldiers and living off of chicken feed. These stories were very common in Huzah, a town of 10,000 that witnessed the worst violence. But again, there were aspects of the operation that increased violence on the civilian population, specifically the Hannibal Directive. And when I went to Rafah, the southernmost city in Gaza, bordering both Egypt and Israel, I heard about Black Friday on August 1st. That's what the people in Rafah referred to August 1st as. And this is when an Israeli patrol from the elite Unit 101 paratrooper brigade from the Givati brigade invaded the town and occupied a house an hour and a half hour before a ceasefire was set to take place. So they were about to violate the ceasefire. They were attacked by an Al-Qassam ambush brigade, and one of their members was wounded, and the ambush team attempted to take him into a tunnel to capture him. He was Hadar Golden, the second cousin of the Israeli defense minister. So in other words, the elite of the elite. The commanding officer of the Givati brigade invokes the Hannibal Directive. Hannibal is heard blaring over military radios, and he later admitted to doing it. In other words, the order to kill Golden, his captors, and everyone in the perimeter. Basically, the Hannibal Directive was used as a mechanism to allow the soldiers to get revenge on the entire population of Rafah. And so once again, 500-pound dumb bombs fall on Rafah. Tank shells, naval shells, shells from Israeli naval boats, drones, Apache helicopters, mortars, everything falls on the neighborhood. You go into homes and you see people actually using spent mortar shells as ashtrays and vases because they're so, you can find them just anywhere. I would step over the shells and missiles just walking down the street. Families attempted to evacuate to the Al-Najjar hospital, which was the only major functioning hospital in Rafah. Then Israel threatened to bomb the hospital. So everyone had to leave. Hundreds of wounded people, dead people had to be evacuated. And they were sent to a small OBGYN and dental clinic called Kuwaiti Hospital in the center of town with 20 beds. There I met Dr. Samir Holmes, who told me that he performed amputations on the floor in the hallways in dental chairs, and that he had to order ice cream coolers from local corner stores to store the dead bodies of children. He put body parts in nearby meat lockers. Ofer Winter, the commanding officer of the Givati Brigade, had issued a letter to his troops before the war, declaring that this war would not be a war against enemy combatants, or even necessarily terrorists. It was a war against blasphemy. He accused those who live in the Gaza Strip of sinning against God and called for a holy war. The letter was published in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv. After the war, or during the war, after this Black Friday, he took a victory lap in Yediot Aharonot, which is a major Israeli newspaper, and said that there are no civilians in the Gaza Strip. Everyone has a bomb in their house, and in any case, they're all raising their children to be terrorists. In a sense, he legitimized, if not genocide in practice, then a genocidal attitude. He then boasted, "We shredded them," those exact words. This, to me, is a smoking gun that needs to be investigated, and it's something that I highlighted at the Russell Tribunal. That you have a commanding officer, someone who embodies this messianic religious nationalist attitude, after committing these atrocities, boasting that he shredded people, and that he made no attempt to distinguish between civilians and combatants. And you know, Al-Qassam members wear uniforms and operate like a military force. So the distinction was clear. As the war drew down, this is when I entered. It turned into an aerial war. It was no longer a ground war. And in an Israeli society, the marginalized leftist forces had been generally crushed. There were repeated demonstrations in Tel Aviv where right-wingers came out in an organized fashion, organizing around Facebook pages like Order Number 8, which was a Facebook page set up by the right-wing rapper The Shadow, named after the order that's invoked when reservists are called to battle, calling for the beating and attacks on quote-unquote traitors. And so we saw these intimidation tactics used against Israeli dissidents. Their pictures were taken at demonstrations and posted online. A number of demonstrators, anti-war demonstrators, were followed home and beaten in front of their doorsteps. Gideon Levy, who most of you know, Haaretz had to hire a bodyguard for him because of his criticism of the Israeli Air Force. There were so many death threats. A number of Israeli media personalities were threatened with physical violence, even though they supported the war, because of perceived opposition to the war. Hanin Zoabi, the most hated woman in Israel, the Palestinian-Israeli legislator from Nazareth, has been suspended for 6 months, I think on her way out of the Knesset. And these are the accomplishments that Netanyahu and the right wing can boast about as they survey the scene in Gaza. There was a Facebook page that was set up early on before the war called The People of Israel Demand Revenge. This is before the war. It got 35,000 likes. And we saw the vigilante campaign of revenge against Mohammed al-Qadr and random attacks on Palestinians. The attack on the Gaza Strip in many ways was the official revenge campaign to satiate the bloodlust of a society that sees no solution to the settler colonial reality that it finds itself in. The war ended during ceasefire negotiations with the attack and destruction of 3 of the Gaza City's main civilian residential towers, Zafar 4, the Basha Tower, the oldest tower in the Gaza Strip, which is home to all the media offices, so it was an attack on the media, and the Italian compound, which is home to some of the nicest cafes. Who does cafe bombings? These were terrorist attacks against the civilian population, deliberately wielded against those that Israel deemed to be the most opposed to Hamas. They were attempting to turn the civilian population against Hamas before ceasefire negotiations concluded. Of course, they simply wound up making Abu al-Baida, the spokesman for the Al-Qassam brigades, the most beloved and revered man in the Gaza Strip. The war concluded with a stalemate. However, the real winners, in my opinion, were the far right in Israel. The people of Israel, the quote-unquote people of Israel, had their revenge. Meanwhile, Gaza lays in ruins, and there's no telling when reconstruction will begin. For the first time, we saw exports from the Gaza Strip since the war's conclusion. But people are finding alternate locations to live in. Yet 25% of the Gaza Strip is uninhabitable. And the UN has already predicted that the entire Gaza Strip will be uninhabitable by 2020. There is really no end in sight for the immiseration of the Gaza Strip, and it really calls for serious intervention, heightened intervention from abroad, particularly here where I think the best organizing, most aggressive organizing is taking place. So now we can do questions. Thanks a lot.